come before you this evening having felt that having participated or listened to talks all day in the symposium, I feel like I've been on one of those kind of tasting menu experiences. Have you ever done those, you know, where you've had a little glass of wine with each one, and as the day's gone by, you get more and more kind of sated, but kind of really enjoying it. And now I'm in the business of trying to provide something for you to partake in. I'm not sure, I'm a bit oversated for it, but I certainly feel extremely encouraged and enthused on lots of fronts. We've heard some great examples today of fantastic kind of research-rich education approaches, some really cutting-edge things that are going on across the school. And of course, we've had our wonderful Changemaker student presentations where the students have really shown us what they can do when they collaborate together to investigate aspects of the LSE student experience and give recommendations to us. So, you know, if you did miss out on any of those, do follow up on them. So I'm really just going to pull a few thoughts together and drawing on some of my previous work and thinking. I think some of you will know at least that before I came to LSE, I was Professor of Higher Education up at the road at UCL, and so some of the things I'll be talking about will be just drawing on some of those thoughts, but also really particularly thinking about where we are at LSE today in the light of publication of LSE 2030 and what kind of school we want to be as we move forward. So, powerful learning for a challenging world. I'll start off with the easy bit, the challenging world. I don't know what you would have put on a slide for sort of a visual representation of a challenging world, but frankly, we have so much to choose from to illustrate. What would you have put? Maybe a picture of the, I don't know, the President of the US, or I don't know, a word beginning with B that shall remain unmentionable, and obviously, you know, climate change and so many huge examples. This is actually a hunger map of the world from 2018 and highlights some huge inequalities around the world in terms of just access to basic sustenance. You don't need me to elaborate on why the world is challenging, but what I'd just like to propose is that it's the kind of world that is so multifaceted. The philosopher of higher education, Ron Barnett, talks about a super complex kind of world that we live in, where not only have we got lots of different challenges, but we've got lots of competing and conflicting frameworks for actually understanding and applying those, you know, addressing those issues. But in the context of the very challenging world that our students are graduating into and indeed living in as we're with them or as they're with us, we need to really think about what kind of learning and what kind of vision we have as we move forward. Now, some of you will have seen this before, and I'm kind of just going to put it there rather briefly because I'll be coming back to it at the end. But one of the great challenges of having a strategy or trying to distill a strategy for a school as rich and diverse and historic and, you know, beautifully rooted and stretching as the LSE, is that anything you distill it into is kind of too small and silly. On the other hand, you kind of need some pegs to address some issues with, and to try and distill some of the contributions that have been made also to thinking about the strategy. So we've been finding it useful to have these kind of three circles, if you like, very much overlapping circles of embedding research practices, really enriching our curricula through different ways in which we conceptualize the connections between research and student learning. Engaging communities, and that's both within the school, but also finding better ways of students to engage with external audiences and partners. But also, very importantly, empowering all students and all staff. Just still on the student heading, students as critical investigators, students as leaders of change, which we've seen very much in the Changemakers projects today, and students as creators and producers in the world and for this complicated world, is a kind of way that we've characterized some of the key ideas from the strategy. But I'm picking up on the word empowering with the idea of powerful learning. And some of you may be aware that the notion of powerful knowledge has been kind of much disputed and written about and problematized in terms of education as a specialism, and particularly in relation to, for example, the school curriculum. What does it mean to give, say, all students across schools, for example, in the UK, access to powerful knowledge, and what might that mean? So thinking about, and obviously I'm critiquing the notion of powerful as well. We are a social sciences school, of course, and there's no social sciences discipline, I'm sure, that wouldn't be very happy and readily critique the notion of powerful. Traditionally, when we've thought about really world-leading schools, universities like LSE, we often hear this is higher education, this is stretching, and it's kind of difficult, and in some ways it's elite. But how do we relate the idea of elite knowledge and that kind of powerful stretching knowledge to the idea of inclusion? How are we going to kind of square that circle? So how can we ensure, if we are doing something stretching and powerful, if you like, that applies to students from all backgrounds? We have a great record here at LSE for widening participation, but we still need to do more, and we need to make sure that when our diverse students come to us, that we give them a truly kind of inclusive experience. And some of our Changemakers projects earlier reflected on and analysed the fact that that isn't consistently what students are getting at the moment. So if we want our students to step out into the world with confidence and hope, what kind of learning will empower them to do that? There's this notion of powerful knowledge. If we've thought about knowledge traditionally as this kind of higher learning, we've often thought about rigour and stretch. We've also often thought about narrow specialisms. And so that in the traditions of higher education, actually not always, but in more recent traditions, we've settled into disciplines. And often the disciplinary specialism has been seen as being the difficult, powerful thing that we kind of give our students access to, and some of them make it and they join us in that kind of powerful place, and some of the students don't make it, and we become the gatekeepers because they haven't quite kind of made it over the line. And I'm slightly exaggerating, but there are contexts in which that feels like a kind of rather narrow space to which not all students can access. And I'm not for a moment suggesting that the powerful learning that I want to promote does not include rigour and stretch and real expertise of the kind that one would find in the specialisms. I think what I'm kind of dwelling on, reflecting on, is that that isn't enough for a very complicated world, because unless we can make cross connections, unless we can come out of those specialist spaces and perhaps have a broader experience with learning as well, that we're not necessarily that we're not really giving students the best possible advantage. So the notion of disciplinarity with established truths and practices and a revered canon is one that, you know, we've obviously dealt with, we've explored over various decades, and things come round in circles about, you know, who must you, if you're going to be an economist, or if you're going to be you know, if you're going to graduate with a politics degree, or if you're going to do philosophy, what is the sine qua non of a degree in those areas? So Young and Muller, particularly talking about kind of mainstream education, if you like, have done quite a lot of work on this notion of powerful knowledge. And they describe it as being both a sociological concept, as we know, they draw on Durkheim, and a curriculum principle. And they write, we intuitively feel, they're not really talking about themselves, they're talking about all of us, intuitively feel that some knowledges are better epistemically, morally, or aesthetically than others. And they represent criteria about what is true, what is beautiful, and how we should treat our fellow human beings and the non-human world that are more universal than others. So those of us who are very familiar with the idea of the kind of cultural and historical specificity of knowledge, and the fact that we can't say that some things are ubiquitously agreed to be better and true and right, will obviously critique that notion. And they obviously, make reference to that, and they kind of try and come to some accommodation with it. You might recall that on the national stage, in terms of the school national curriculum, there was an argument over a number of years about what should be in the school national curriculum. So should all students study history and learn the dates of all the kings and queens? And is it vital, if you're going to study history or be a proper person, or I suppose at the moment it's be a proper person in the UK or probably England, should you have learned all the kings and queens? And is that the right knowledge to have? And Young and Muller actually argue that elitist knowledge of the kind that traditionally was more available to the wealthier sections of our society and less available to more disadvantaged groups, that we don't do the disadvantaged groups any favour by just saying all you need are lots of skills. You don't really need knowledge, you just need lots of kind of generic skills, because what you're not doing is giving them access to that, what you might call elite knowledge, but you might also call traditionally established, well-established kind of canon in terms of kind of the content that is disciplinary, that is valued within and perhaps across disciplines. So it's an interesting and nuanced kind of position to take. In fact, Young and Muller say if we accept the fundamental human rights principle that human beings should be treated equally, it follows that any curriculum should be based on an entitlement to this knowledge. So they talk about the kind of power or the empowerment of being entitled to access difficult knowledge, demanding, stretching knowledge, and so on. And they also make the case, and I would certainly support this myself, that powerful specialist knowledge should not equate to the knowledge of the powerful, so that we don't get that the wrong way round and always be deducing that the knowledge owned by the powerful is in fact the powerful knowledge that we need for the world today. So obviously we take a critical stance. They also argue that specialist knowledge shouldn't disappear into complete relativity. I'm sure you'll all have your thoughts about this, depending on your disciplinary framing for addressing such issues. Now, as you may very well know, there's a lot of work going on in universities today, and the LSE is happily no exception, which is addressing the canon. What are we teaching? What are we putting into our curricula? And a lot of work being done about decolonising the curriculum, or when I was at UCL, we called it liberating the curriculum, and really looking at whether the content of the curriculum fairly represents knowledge from around the globe, and different ways of knowing and different ways of expressing and communicating knowledge. And I'm really excited to see that there is a lot of activity going on at LSE, and indeed we will be discussing in weeks and months to come a new inclusive learning and teaching strategy that will have decolonising the curriculum as one of those strands for us to actually have a look at. And the students, the Changemaker students, for example, very interested in being partners with us to look at ways in which we can critically engage with our own spaces in terms of the curriculum that we consider to be the appropriate curriculum for our fantastic students here at the LSE. And of course, we have a linked, possibly linked, some scholars argue that there is definitely a link, and issue of what the government calls the attainment gap, whereby students from particular backgrounds, we have Black and Asian minority ethnic students, consistently are awarded less highly, taking into account as well the grades that they come in with, than white students in terms of their degree outcomes. In fact, there's been a lot in the press this week. I think there was an article in The Guardian, maybe? I can't remember. There's probably several, because a paper has come out from the Office for Students. So do take a look, and that's something else we're going to be looking at as well. I'm proposing that we think of it not as an attainment gap, but as an award gap, because what we're essentially doing is criticising the issue of whether in fact the students are attaining less, or whether for some very complex set of reasons they're getting lower awards, which is not the same as attaining less in terms of attaining less knowledge for sure, So there's a lot of challenging thinking to be done, and some dialogue, some engagement, some applying our own social science insights that we have in such richness here at the LSE to those particular issues and the relationship between those two themes. I mean, incidentally, that second theme about the attainment gap, we are being required as an institution to set ourselves targets and to make sure that we're actually addressing these themes, and the metrics around attainment gaps are one of the things that come up in the teaching excellence framework judgments. So it isn't just something that we want to look at because it's important, because it's about values, it's about being an inclusive community. It's also something that we're being asked to address right across the sector. So I said something earlier about disciplinary boundaries, and I don't want to kind of keep going around the houses with this, but to me it's absolutely fundamental. If we assume that a knowledge specialism is the highest kind of powerful knowledge, then what we might create is a degree programme that becomes, that is so specialised all the way through and has so little opportunity for students to step back and into a wider intellectual space where they can make connections between a way of knowing in this subject and a way of knowing in another subject and use that as an opportunity to critique, then I personally believe that we're not doing them a great service. And we had Patrick Dunleavy talking to us just earlier in the session about some fantastic work on the MPA and also the PPE programme. I don't know if Alex is still here. We were hearing about the interdisciplinary spaces that were being stretched and kind of created. And it was really great to hear that. And I know there's a lot of that going on. But as a school, I think we need to be self-aware about the extent to which very specialist programmes and programmes that offer some more opportunity for reaching out, whether that's fundamental to the whole programme, the interdisciplinarity, or whether it's just some opportunity for the students to step out, obviously is for us to, or for you all, to decide. Nobody is going to dictate these things, but I think it's something to reflect on. This is some work from the British Academy. I don't know if you've seen it. They did a number of publications around interdisciplinarity, and they're particularly looking at the way research now is very much more interdisciplinary, and the kind of funding for interdisciplinary projects is kind of reshaping some of the research fields, and which I find interesting. They also problematise it and have a number of case studies there. So I guess, I've said this, how many of our students actually engage in learning activities and research projects that ask them explicitly to examine the relationship between different disciplinary intellectual frameworks, modes of inquiry, language codes, types of output, types of scholarly output, different forms of output. What our students have a lot of at LSE, in a lot of programmes at least, is choice. So they choose between a lot of different kind of possibilities for their courses. But where in the design of the degree are we explicitly challenging the students to say, what are the connections between those different ways of knowing, and what can each of those different approaches kind of tell you about ways of thinking about that complex world out there, and ways in which you can take forward a kind of very nuanced intellectual grasp of complex or wicked challenges, as they're sometimes called. And then slightly, one small step away from this is something I ponder on quite often. So having come here to the LSE from UCL, which is an extremely multidisciplinary and very large institution, and I come here and I'm surrounded by the world's best social scientists, broadly conceived. We're quite a broad church kind of social sciences school, really. And yet, when I think about how much our own expertise is applied to understanding ourselves, I think we've missed a trick. I know I'm being recorded, so I feel slightly cautious about saying it, but I'm going to say this anyway. I was in a meeting, and I'm not going to tell you who it was that said this, when fairly early on when I arrived at LSE, where I said, I think one of the things we need to do is to invest more in researching ourselves. And what we need is, we need higher education researchers working with us to understand ourselves, or even one working with us to understand ourselves better. And in the meeting, the answer was, well, I don't really see what a researcher is going to tell us that we don't already know. Okay, so this is slightly akin to I'm a woman, so why do I need to have, study gender studies or read about feminism or something? It was slightly that kind of. So I think sometimes we're not as self-aware in terms of understanding. For example, we are an organisation. What do we know about organisational development at the LSE? Because we have some world-leading scholars in those fields. Obviously, from a learning point of view, we have psychological and behavioural sciences. We have we have experts in well-being and happiness. We have all kinds of methodologies. We have all sorts of expertise in the LSE that we're not necessarily applying because we haven't invested in it. I'm not expecting everybody to do it as a sort of side job, as it were, on top of the day job. But we haven't invested in it, and we haven't perhaps recognised it as being something that we should do a bit more of. So are we taking full account of our own expertise and our own evidence-based findings? So I'm powerful learning, remember, for a complicated and challenging world. And powerful learning to me is not just about what the students are learning, it's actually about us being aware that research and investigation is actually a form of learning that we need to keep our eyes on as a community and make sure we don't miss a trick because we see ourselves as the experts in the difficult stuff, and we don't necessarily step back and say, actually, there's stuff for us to learn, and particularly through collaborating across the disciplines. And then there's the values piece, isn't there? Why? A powerful knowledge for what purpose? So Rindal, in a rather abstract article, actually, about the European university kind of sector, cites a letter written by a school principal who survived World War II. Dear teacher, I'm a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no man should witness, gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses. So I am suspicious of education. My request is, help your students become human. Very moving piece. There's more to it. I gave you a little extract. So then we throw into the mix, to what extent does powerful knowledge, or as I'm couching it, powerful learning, need to have a foregrounded kind of values piece? Because, of course, there are values in everything we do and everything we decide not to do. The silences of what we teach as well as what we teach. There are values. There's a values framework there somewhere. And the question is, to what extent do we foreground that and actually make it part of our learning and engage our students in thinking about what that values framework is? Rindal asks, what kind of knowledge will make a difference and influence one's life as an existing being? We should view education first and foremost as a question of being responsible in relation to oneself as a human being. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, I don't know what she's going on about or why she's talking about this. I teach, I don't want to name anything. No, I teach, statistics, or I teach something, very important and quantitative like statistics. And so why should I be thinking about the values and, at what point do I get the students thinking about these kinds of things? And of course, I'm not saying that in every lesson or even necessarily in every single course, we need to be having this kind of values discussion. But in the course of a whole degree, if there's not an opportunity for students, again, to step out and to problematize, to consider, to evaluate, to analyze, the silences of texts, the kind of implied values base of a particular methodological approach or a particular theoretical framework, then I think we are doing them a disservice, and that to me is not an example of powerful learning. So you may very well have different views, and I'm sure you'll have questions and comments afterwards. And Tony Harland, who's a professor of ecology at Otago University in New Zealand, has done some amazing work of really working with undergraduate students in the kind of research space. He's kind of almost breaking down a lot of those barriers between teaching, learning and research, and he's researching with students even at undergraduate levels. We had some great examples of that earlier on from some of our colleagues today. But when he talks, he says, well, in higher education, what should powerful knowledge be about? And so his framing of powerful knowledge for higher education, drawing on some of the other earlier scholars that I referred to, is of being skilled in producing one's knowledge, of being able to evaluate knowledge claims, being able to apply the skills of production and evaluation to different knowledge contexts over time, and being prepared to use knowledge wisely for the good of oneself and others. So he's built in that kind of values piece in that last bullet point. And I guess I just invite you this evening, before you go home and do whatever you're going to do this evening, or come to the staff awards, which I'm sure will be a great event, to just reflect on what your list would be. What would your list for powerful learning? What are you trying to achieve? What are we trying to achieve? What are you trying to achieve in your department? What are we trying to achieve as a school? And some of you will be familiar with this, which is my framing, the connected curriculum framing of really trying to build synergies, again, between education and research. And I thought I would just use this to highlight some ways in which I think we can empower students. So that the core of the graphic is the sort of this core principle of getting students to learn through research and inquiry. Because what we know now in the 21st century, in this digital age, is that memorizing an awful lot of difficult stuff is not enough. In fact, sometimes it's not necessary, depending on context. But what really empowers students is developing their capacity to investigate in a range of different sorts of contexts. The first dimension here is about students connecting with researchers and research. And this is about empowering students through connecting with researchers and research at the cutting edge of knowledge. When I did the sort of background research and activity that led to the book on connected curriculum, one of the things I did was to invite feedback from a number of the research-intensive institutions across Europe. And I got a really good piece from Cambridge, of all places. Cambridge, goodness. Where they apparently were so interested in my question. I can just imagine this. I don't know if any of you have worked at Cambridge. Possibly some of you have. I'm just kind of imagining one of the Cambridge colleges, them having this sort of erudite discussion, because the question was really, what is the benefit to the students of studying in a research-rich or research-intensive environment? And they apparently had a long discussion about what they thought the real benefits were, and they came up with a number of things. But one of the things they said, really kind of resonated with me, which was the main thing that they focused on at the end of their debate was that it was what you can do in a research-rich environment with students is you can show students where the edge of knowledge is. You can show them what we don't know. You can learn stuff online. You can go to a lot of other perfectly fine institutions where students will be taught what we appear to know, and they'll learn that and they'll be tested on it. But what we can do in a really research-rich context is to take students right to the edge of what we know. These are really clearly the things we don't know here, and help them to understand how knowledge is produced and created. The second dimension of the connected curriculum is about creating a through line of research in the design of each degree programme. Empowering students to build research skills and to develop a joined-up narrative that connects inquiry with their own identity and values and intentions. And again, this is really tricky with our modularised system. But I've had discussions with a number of you, and there will be more, about how one can actually design a degree with a sort of central core that runs up through the middle of it, that is much more connected and doesn't have to be devolved all the time into boxes. So if you're interested in that, do engage with me and with TLC and about different ways of doing that. And some of you will be familiar with this that I've been promoting, the idea of a programme level showcase portfolio. that enables students, I don't mean as an addition, but built into the design of the degree, although we're actually going to test the proof of concept by inviting some students to do it as an addition after they've graduated. That we ask students to select the best of their work, the work that they've produced, some of which we hope will be outward-facing and kind of varied in form, and actually produce a showcase portfolio of the best of what they do. I won't go through that in detail, but do take a look, and we'll be sharing all sorts of approaches and suggestions. If you're interested in doing something quite radical like this with your degree programme, do let us know. The students are really, really interested in it. The Students' Union really engage with the idea of this, because students understand that if they produce something that is public, it gives them all sorts of advantages in the workplace. It gives them an opportunity to connect with their families back in, wherever they're from or whatever, by showcasing things that they're actually doing. And there's so many benefits to it. And there are some challenges too, but there are great benefits. Thirdly, it's about empowering students to select and combine different disciplinary approaches, and I've talked about this already, so I won't rehearse it again, but it sort of fits as part of the whole concept of the connected curriculum kind of scheme. And then there's empowering students to see and articulate academic professional links and skills. And again, traditionally, especially in elite universities, there was a lot of us would say, well, what is the workplace to us? This is an academic establishment. It's not our job to consider or to really help the students sort of understand how what they're learning here relates to workplace skills and future learning. But I would say that is quite an elitist position, because that's fine if you've got loads of social capital and cultural capital and economic capital that you take with you, and you're already well networked into the world, and you're going to get a great job anyway because of the background you've come from. But if you're like me and you're the first in your family to go to university, not being helped in some way to think about the relationship between your academic learning and your workplace learning, workplace opportunities, is not doing you any favours. So I'll kind of leave that there. There's some really interesting examples in the book, if you're interested, which you can download for free from UCL Press. But I think it's something that we need not to ignore, and we need to think about across the whole course of a degree, whether we're actually providing the right opportunities for students. And then the fourth one there is about empowering students to become producers and confident communicators to diverse audiences. And again, this links with the showcase portfolio idea, that we have we have traditionally had students producing written work in a very similar form all of the time and writing it to us, instead of thinking about, if we were to say this to a range of different sorts of audiences, in what kinds of forms would we produce this? And I'm not saying they would do that for everything, but somewhere along the course of the degree, to actually have that diversity of output, if you like, as students as producers. And then finally, but last but definitely not least, empowering students to become part of an inclusive community of students, alumni, scholars and professionals. And if you were here earlier with our student change makers who had done the projects on inclusion and belonging and so on here at LSE, you would not look at that and think, oh, I can take that or leave it. You would think, no, we absolutely have to find some better ways of making sure that all students feel included, whether they have disabilities, whether from particular backgrounds, whatever it might be, that they do feel equally valued within our school. And then, just drawing these thoughts to a close, empowering scholarly educators. So we have a room full of wonderful experts. I know you all come with your different roles, and your job titles may be quite different. But if you're here today, it's probably because you care about, and in some way you're contributing to, a scholarly community where education is important. And I write a bit about, well, this is a piece that Claire and I did before I even came to LSE. We write about the idea of strengths-based scholarship for educators. So powerful learning for the students is really important, but what about the kind of learning that we engage in? And it's wonderful that a day like this enables us to share ideas and to listen to others. That strengths-based scholarship in this context is about encouraging us to play to our strengths, our interests, our values and contexts, that builds on our values, passions, intellectual curiosity and preferred modes of expression. I did a keynote at one point where I was talking about this, and I had people came up to me afterwards and they were in tears, and it was very interesting. I couldn't quite work out what had happened in the dynamic. But they were basically, I'd asked the question about whether people in the audience felt that because of the job they were in or the context in which they were working, they were having to work in quite a small space. And there wasn't a kind of opportunity for you to expand and expand your scholarly thinking and make connections and really make the contribution that you want to the wider group. And I was astonished by how many people came up and said, that's me. That's me. I've got more to offer. I want to do more. I want more space. I need more intellectual landscape to occupy. But because of the job role I have, I feel too narrowly situated. So if that's you, then let's all have a conversation about how we can all play to our strengths and broaden the kind of spaces in which we're working. Again, I won't talk about this in detail, but in a paper on scholarship, I talk about the connections between the core of scholarship, which is about engagement informed by critical inquiry and dialogue, and the different aspects of it. So, of course, we've got research, but we've got inquiry into research. What works for research, what doesn't? We've got academic development, where we're developing ourselves as educators and academics and indeed professionals. Inquiry into education. Some of you will be familiar with the term the scholarship of teaching and learning, where you're actually really researching how teaching and learning works, and of course some really important work done in that area by the Teaching and Learning Centre and LTI and other colleagues. And of course education itself is a scholarly practice that we need to learn about. And scholarly leadership. Perhaps you're in a leadership role of some kind, by which I don't mean management. I mean leading the way forward in some sort of context. And do you consider that to be scholarly work? Do you consider that to be a kind of place for powerful learning? Because there's no reason why it should be any less important than other things, than other elements. So again, to draw towards the close, I think as educators that we should broaden our horizons and develop practices through dialogue with those who bring other perspectives, including, of course, not only colleagues, but students, alumni, partners, that we draw on our existing expertise, our professionalism, our modes of inquiry to investigate aspects of our own practices that are genuinely meaningful to us where that becomes appropriate. Or we can invite colleagues from TLC, LTI to come and do some investigation with us about the things that we're doing and are they working? Could they work differently? And again, and this is really important to me, I used to once be my first lecturing role was in communications, and it was the English actually, but English in communications, and I think the communication theory side of it and practice I got very involved with and realised just what a difference it makes to knowing if you think about a range of different types of communicating that knowing, rather than just a single type of communication. I think authentic modes of inquiry and of expression. So why are we not using more podcasts and videos and all those sorts of things, and rather than only focusing on written pieces, for example, for our students? I know some people are, which is great to see. And then, of course, we've had our wonderful example of change makers, where our students can be leaders of change in this space, and they're really expressing their powerful learning through the Change Makers projects, because they're in effect acting as researchers, advising the school. And what a wonderful, rounded, broad space that is, where our students are researchers and advising us. And that relationship between us and them and the dialogue that we can have, I think, is a really rich example of a kind of collective, powerful learning. And, just I'd sort of throw this in, do we invest enough in interrogating our own education-related organisation practices, and do we even make best use of the good practice resources we got. So quick plug for the course, case studies and other really great resources on the school website where we've got colleagues talking about great things they're doing, but we don't necessarily have the time to access and the opportunity to access, so we really need to do that. So as a school, what should we do? Well, I'd say we should draw on scholarly values and evidence to make decisions about institutional directions. Are we doing that? Or are we just kind of going with our gut instinct all the time? And that we should resource communities of scholars with time and opportunities to really occupy this broader space. And that might mean reviewing job roles to make sure that all expertise really is recognised. Rewarding scholars for contribution to knowledge and practice, and recognising particular contexts, because we're all working in very different disciplinary and organisational contexts. And again, acting on shared values and critiquing one another's values, just being aware of it, including promotion of dignity at work, which we've been looking at as a school, and issues like work-life balance. It's all very well having these wonderfully principled approaches to can't we be a wonderful scholarly community if half the people, at least, in the institution are so exhausted because the work-life balance is not right, that we're all being challenged with sort of, mental health issues and so on. And we have to be realistic. It can be a tough and demanding place to be. But we need to get the balance right. So finding our voices, are there artificial boundaries around us and our work, separating education, professionalism, research, engagement, application? Are we building on our real values and passions? And are we finding spaces to build stronger narratives and clearer voices in our own individual and collective parts of the school? And so turning back to this, I did a little tweak from students as critical investigators to scholars as critical investigators. Because actually, of course, scholars can apply to students and to us, can't it? So why don't we just say, because we've said empowering all students and all staff, so maybe we substitute scholars, and then we can include us all in that community. Ron Barnett, a philosopher, says that the task of university leadership, unlike university management, is that of infusing a university with energy, with spirit. Energy and spirit is quite tricky at 10 to 5 in the evening after a very long day. Certainly the energy bit, but let's hope the spirit is kind of getting there. I'm inspiring you with my lovely view of Sidmouth, which is where I live in Devon. That's kind of my, it's 100 metres from where I live, so you can see why I'm fairly mellow. But in terms of leadership, who are the leaders here at LSE? Because, it isn't just, perhaps it isn't even the senior management team. It's us, isn't it? It's those of us who are leading the way in the context in which we're working. And so I think, this is my final slide, if we really recognise these profound connections between the themes that I've very briefly touched on this evening: power, knowledge, curriculum, values, dialogue and inclusion, scholarship, that space where teaching and research meet, and enhancing our own school practices. If we see the connections between those things, then we've all got a stake in it, haven't we? And we can all lead we can all lead the way forward. So my final proposition is let's lead together through dialogue, through values-based scholarly investigations and engagement with colleagues across the school to enable LSE to make an even more impact on this very, very challenging world. Thank you.